I woke up to find my entire family dead. Everyone thought I killed them. The detective's words still echo in my mind even now. Months after that horrific morning when I woke up to find my husband and 3 children lying cold and lifeless in their beds. "Mrs. Rebecca Morrison, you're under arrest for 4 counts of murder," he said as he snapped the handcuffs around my wrists while I stood there in my nightgown, screaming that I didn't do it, that I would never hurt my babies, that someone needed to help me understand what was happening because just hours ago we were all laughing together at dinner. But nobody believed me, especially not my husband's family, who showed up at the crime scene with hatred burning in their eyes, and my mother-in-law Diane actually spat at my feet and called me a monster before the police could pull her away. Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare. Back to when my life was still normal and I had no idea that in 24 hours I would lose everything I ever loved. Before we continue, have you ever been in a situation where you are innocent but no one believed you? Comment I have below. And if you enjoy stories that reveal how karma really works, make sure you're subscribed and turn on the notification bell. Like this story so that more people can see it. You don't want to miss what happens next. My name is Rebecca Morrison and I was married to David Morrison for 12 years, and we had 3 beautiful children. Emma, who was 10, Michael, who was 8, and little Sophie, who had just turned 6. David came from a wealthy family that owned several commercial properties across the state, and when we got married, his family wasn't exactly thrilled because I came from a working-class background and had put myself through nursing school with student loans and night shifts at diners. But David loved me and he didn't care what his family thought, and over the years I worked hard to prove myself to them, hosting perfect family dinners and making sure their grandchildren were well-mannered and accomplished. His mother Diane eventually warmed up to me, or at least I thought she did, and his father Richard was always polite even if a bit distant, but there was one person in that family who made me uncomfortable in ways I could never quite explain: David's younger brother Marcus. Marcus was 2 years younger than David and had always lived in his older brother's shadow, and while David was confident and successful, Marcus struggled with jobs and relationships and still lived in a small apartment that his parents helped pay for. I first met Marcus at a coffee shop 6 months before I met David, and he struck up a conversation with me while I was studying for my nursing exams, asking me questions about my life and seeming genuinely interested. But I was so focused on my studies and work that I politely ended the conversation and didn't think much of it. Then 6 months later I met David at a hospital charity event where he was representing his family's foundation, and we hit it off immediately, and within a year we were married, and it wasn't until the wedding reception that Marcus pulled me aside and told me he'd seen me first at that coffee shop and had planned to ask me out but never got the courage. The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he was accusing me of something, like I had stolen something that belonged to him, and when I told David about it later, he laughed it off and said Marcus had always been socially awkward and I shouldn't take it personally. Over the years Marcus would show up at our house unannounced, always with some excuse about needing to borrow tools or ask David's advice about something. But I noticed how his eyes would linger on me a bit too long and how he'd find reasons to brush past me in the kitchen or stand too close when we were talking. David never seemed to notice, or maybe he just trusted his brother too much to see what I saw, and I never pushed the issue because I didn't want to cause family drama over what I thought might just be my imagination running wild. The day before everything fell apart was actually a beautiful day, and we'd spent the afternoon at the park with the kids flying kites and eating ice cream, and David was laughing and chasing Sophie around while Emma and Michael competed to see whose kite could fly higher. We came home around 5 in the evening and I started preparing dinner while David helped the kids with their homework, and I made their favorite meal: my homemade lasagna with garlic bread and Caesar salad. Marcus actually stopped by around 6:30 that evening, claiming he wanted to return a drill he'd borrowed from David weeks ago, and David invited him to stay for dinner even though I wished he hadn't because I'd only made enough for our family. But I stretched the portions and set an extra place at the table, and during dinner Marcus kept complimenting my cooking in this overly enthusiastic way that felt forced, telling me over and over how lucky David was to have such a talented wife and how he wished he could find someone who cooked like I did. After dinner, David and Marcus went to the garage to look at some problem with David's car while I cleaned up the kitchen and got the kids ready for bed. And by the time the dishes were done and the kids were tucked in, Marcus had already left and David was in the living room watching the news. We stayed up until about 10:30 talking about our plans for the weekend, and then we went to bed like we did every other night, with absolutely no indication that it would be the last time I'd ever see my family alive. I woke up around 7 the next morning feeling strange, like my body was heavy and my head was foggy, and I realized David wasn't in bed next to me, which was unusual because he never woke up before me on weekends. I called out his name but got no response, and when I walked into the bathroom I found him collapsed on the floor, his skin a grayish color and his eyes wide open staring at nothing. I screamed and dropped to my knees, checking for a pulse and finding none, and my nursing training kicked in as I started CPR while simultaneously trying to call 911 with shaking hands. But something told me to check on the kids, some horrible instinct that made me abandon David's body and run down the hall to their rooms, and what I found there shattered my entire world into pieces that could never be put back together. Emma was in her bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Michael was on the floor beside his bed like he'd tried to get up but couldn't make it, and little Sophie was curled up in a ball with vomit on her pillow. All of them were dead, all of them gone, and I remember collapsing in the hallway between their rooms and screaming so loud that the neighbors called the police before my 911 call even went through. The police arrived within minutes and found me sitting in the hallway covered in vomit from trying to perform CPR on my children, and I was so hysterical that I couldn't form coherent sentences, just kept saying over and over that they were dead, that someone killed them, that I didn't know what happened. The paramedics sedated me and took me to the hospital while crime scene investigators descended on my house, and when I woke up hours later in a hospital bed, there were 2 detectives standing over me asking me questions I couldn't comprehend. "Mrs. Morrison, can you tell us what you and your family ate for dinner last night?" The older detective asked, and I told him about the lasagna and garlic bread, told him Marcus had been there for dinner too, told him everything I could remember through my tears and shock. "Did you prepare all the food yourself?" the younger detective asked, and I said yes, that I always cooked for my family, and I watched as they exchanged a meaningful look that I didn't understand at the time. The preliminary autopsy results came back within 48 hours showing that David and the children had died from acute poisoning, specifically from a substance called thallium, which is a heavy metal that's colorless, tasteless, and odorless when mixed into food. The detectives came back to question me again, this time with much harder edges to their voices, asking me about my marriage, about David's life insurance policies, about whether I had been having an affair. Why would I kill my children? I screamed at them through my tears. Why would I kill my babies? They were everything to me. But I could see in their eyes that they'd already made up their minds, and when they asked me where I'd been when everyone was dying, I could only tell them the truth, that I'd been asleep in the same house, in the same bed as my husband, breathing the same air, and somehow I was the only one who survived. David's family held a press conference 3 days later where Diane stood in front of cameras with mascara running down her face and accused me of murdering her son and grandchildren for money, claiming I'd been planning to run away with a secret lover and needed David's life insurance and inheritance to start a new life. She had absolutely no evidence for these claims, just grief and rage that needed a target, and I became that target because I was the only one left alive. Marcus stood behind his mother during that press conference with his head bowed and his hands clasped in front of him, the picture of a grieving brother, and when reporters asked him if he believed I was guilty, he looked directly into the camera and said, "Rebecca was the last person to handle the food that killed my brother and his children. What else are we supposed to think?" Those words sealed my fate in the court of public opinion even before my actual trial began, and when the prosecutor's office charged me with 4 counts of first-degree murder, the whole world seemed convinced of my guilt. My own parents had to hire private security for their house because angry strangers kept showing up to harass them, and my few remaining friends gradually stopped returning my calls because the social stigma of associating with an accused child killer was too much for them to bear. The evidence against me seemed damning on the surface. I'd prepared the meal, I'd been in the house when everyone died, I was the sole beneficiary of David's life insurance policy worth $2 million, and I'd survived without a single symptom while everyone else died horrible deaths. The prosecution built their entire case on the theory that I'd carefully planned this murder for months, researching thallium poisoning and obtaining the substance through my nursing connections, then systematically poisoning my family while somehow protecting myself. But there was one massive problem with their theory that my defense attorney Margaret Chen immediately identified. The toxicology reports showed that thallium was found in the lasagna specifically, in high enough concentrations to kill everyone who ate it, yet I had eaten from the same pan as everyone else. The crime scene investigators had documented that there was only one pan of lasagna made that night, only one serving dish on the table, and everyone including me had eaten from it. How could Rebecca poison food that she herself ate without getting sick? Margaret argued during the preliminary hearings. The prosecution wants you to believe she calculated exactly which portions contained poison and which didn't, that she served herself from a safe section while serving her husband and children from contaminated sections, all while having a dinner guest present who could have noticed such suspicious behavior. It defies logic and common sense. The prosecution countered by bringing in a toxicologist who testified that I could have been taking small doses of a thallium antidote in the days leading up to the murder, building up a tolerance or protection in my system. But Margaret destroyed that theory by pointing out that no such antidote or traces of protective substances were found in my blood work or in my home during the extensive searches. The trial began 4 months after that horrible morning, and I sat in that courtroom every single day wearing simple black dresses and no makeup, looking like exactly what I was, a broken woman who'd lost everything. The prosecution paraded expert witnesses who testified about thallium poisoning, about insurance fraud, about cases of mothers who'd killed their children, and with each testimony I watched the jury's faces grow harder and more convinced of my guilt. Then Margaret began our defense, and she started with something that seemed insignificant but would prove to be crucial. She called Marcus to the stand as a witness. Marcus testified about having dinner with us that night, about how normal everything seemed, about how loving I appeared to be with the children, and the prosecution must have thought he was actually helping their case by establishing I'd been alone with the food preparation. But then Margaret asked him a question that changed everything. "Mr. Morrison, you testified that you left the house around 8 p.m. that evening, correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Marcus answered. "And did you eat the lasagna that Rebecca prepared?" "Yes, I had a plate." "Did you experience any symptoms of illness after eating?" "No, none at all." Margaret let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "So we have a situation where Rebecca allegedly poisoned a pan of lasagna, yet you ate from that same pan and experienced no illness. Rebecca ate from that same pan and experienced no illness, but David and the 3 children who ate from that same pan all died. Does that make sense to you?" The prosecution objected, but the damage was done, and I could see some of the jurors starting to look confused rather than certain. Margaret then brought in her own experts who testified that the pattern of poisoning didn't match a scenario where someone carefully contaminated specific portions, but rather looked like someone had added poison to specific plates after the food was served, which would have been impossible for me to do since I'd been in the kitchen cleaning up while David, Marcus, and the kids were at the table. The trial dragged on for 3 weeks, and with each day I lost more hope because I could see that while Margaret was creating reasonable doubt, she couldn't give the jury what they really wanted: an alternative explanation for who killed my family and why. Without that, they might acquit me legally, but I'd still be guilty in everyone's eyes, still be the woman who somehow got away with murdering her entire family. Then on the 19th day of trial, something happened that nobody expected. The prosecution called Diane Morrison to the stand as a character witness against me, and she spent over an hour describing me as a cold, calculating social climber who trapped her son into marriage and then grown tired of family life. She testified about arguments she claimed to have overheard between David and me, about suspicious behavior she'd noticed, about her absolute conviction that I'd murdered her grandchildren in cold blood. Margaret's cross-examination started gently, asking Diane about her relationship with David, about family dinners and holidays, about how often she'd been to our house. Then Margaret asked a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. "Mrs. Morrison, did your son Marcus have keys to David and Rebecca's house?" Diane looked confused by the question. "I believe so, yes. David gave him a spare set in case of emergencies." "And did Marcus use those keys? Did he come and go from the house when David and Rebecca weren't home?" "I don't know. Perhaps occasionally. They were brothers." Margaret nodded and seemed to move on to other questions, but I could see she was building toward something. The prosecution rested their case the next day, and Margaret stood to begin our defense with what she called a new theory of the crime that had emerged during testimony. She laid out a timeline that prosecutors had missed. Marcus had been the last person other than me to be in the kitchen that night, supposedly helping himself to a glass of water after dinner while I was upstairs with the kids. He'd had access to the leftovers, to the plates, to everything, and most importantly, he'd been in the house alone with David in the garage for nearly 30 minutes after I'd gone upstairs. Plenty of time to contaminate the water pitcher in our bedroom that David and I both drank from during the night. "But wait," Margaret told the jury. "If Marcus poisoned the water pitcher, why didn't Rebecca get sick?" The answer is simple. She didn't drink the water that night. Rebecca has testified that she'd had so much water during dinner that she wasn't thirsty before bed, but David had a full glass from that pitcher, and the children who died had all complained of being thirsty that evening, unusual for them, suggesting they may have already been experiencing early symptoms of poisoning and had gone downstairs for water at some point during the night. It was brilliant theoretically but still circumstantial, and I could see the jury wasn't fully convinced because there was still no clear motive for Marcus to kill his own brother and nephews and niece. The prosecution hammered this point in their rebuttal, asking why a brother who'd shown nothing but grief and support would commit such a heinous act. The jury deliberated for 4 days, and those were the longest 4 days of my entire life because I knew that even if they acquitted me, my life was essentially over. On the afternoon of the 4th day, they came back with a verdict, not guilty on all counts due to insufficient evidence and reasonable doubt, but I could see in their faces that many of them still thought I'd done it and just gotten away with it. I walked out of that courtroom a free woman but completely destroyed, and the media circus outside was vicious with reporters shouting questions about how it felt to get away with murder and whether I'd spend my blood money on my secret lover. I had no secret lover, I had no money because legal fees had drained everything, and I had no family because they were all dead and buried. Diane and Richard refused to even look at me as we left the courthouse, and Marcus gave me this long, searching look that I couldn't interpret, something between pity and something else I couldn't name. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town and tried to rebuild some kind of life, but everywhere I went people recognized me as that woman who probably killed her family, and I couldn't get a nursing job anywhere because no hospital wanted the publicity. 3 months after the trial ended, I was working a night shift at a 24-hour diner under a fake name when Marcus showed up and slid into a booth in my section. My hands started shaking as I approached with a menu, and he looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes that suggested he'd been drinking. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "I have nothing to say to you," I replied, turning to walk away, but he grabbed my wrist. "If you have listened to this point, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notification bell. Also drop a comment below. Now let's continue." "I killed them," he whispered, and the menu fell from my hands and clattered onto the table. I stood frozen as Marcus started crying, really crying, with his whole body shaking as he told me he'd been obsessed with me since that day in the coffee shop, that watching me marry his brother had destroyed him, that he'd spent 12 years watching me be happy with David and it drove him insane with jealousy. He told me he'd researched thallium for over a year, obtaining it through black market contacts and planning the perfect murder that would frame me and eliminate the family I'd built with his brother. I thought after you went to prison, after enough time passed, I could be there for you, could finally have you, Marcus sobbed. But when they acquitted you, when I saw how destroyed you were, I realized what I'd done. I killed 3 innocent children. I killed my own brother. And I ruined you just as completely as if you'd been convicted. I listened to this confession in a state of shock, and part of me wanted to attack him, to scream, to hurt him the way he'd hurt me, but instead I did something that surprised both of us. I pulled out my phone and showed him it had been recording our entire conversation. "You're going to the police," I said quietly. "Right now. You're going to confess everything and you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life in prison. Or I swear I will make this recording public and let David's parents know what you did to their grandchildren." Marcus broke down completely at that point, and I called the police right there from the diner. When the detectives arrived and heard the recording, they arrested Marcus on the spot, and within hours he'd given a full confession including details only the real killer would know, like how he'd contaminated the lasagna with thallium while I was upstairs putting the kids to bed, how he'd pretended to drink water but actually dumped it in the sink, how he'd carefully calculated doses that would kill quickly but not immediately so he'd be long gone when symptoms started. The one twist that nobody saw coming was when Marcus explained why I survived. He'd actually put a much smaller dose in my portion because in his twisted mind, he'd convinced himself that he loved me and couldn't kill me, only frame me. He'd planned for me to get sick but recover, to be arrested and convicted, and then after years in prison for a crime she didn't commit, to somehow still want him when he finally revealed the truth and saved her. The second trial was mercifully quick because Marcus pled guilty to all charges, and during his sentencing hearing he looked at me across the courtroom and said, "I'm sorry," as if those 2 words could somehow undo the fact that he'd murdered 3 children and their father because of a delusional obsession. Diane and Richard Morrison publicly apologized to me through their lawyer, and Diane sent me a handwritten letter that I've never opened because I'm not ready to forgive people who called me a monster on national television. The life insurance money was finally released to me, and I donated every single penny to a foundation for wrongly accused parents because I couldn't bear to touch money that came from my family's deaths. I still work at that diner even though I don't have to because the routine keeps me sane, and I still live in that small apartment because going back to my old house or old life feels impossible. Sometimes customers recognize me from the news coverage of Marcus's confession and trial, and they treat me with a mixture of pity and curiosity that I've learned to tolerate if not accept. Justice was served when Marcus was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, and there's some small comfort in knowing that the world now knows the truth about what happened to my family. But no amount of justice can bring back my husband and children, can give me back the 12 years I had with them, can erase the memory of finding their bodies that horrible morning. I testified at Marcus's sentencing hearing about the impact his actions had on my life, and I looked him directly in the eyes as I described what it felt like to be accused of murdering the only people I'd ever loved, to sit in a courtroom and listen to experts their eyes about how I'd calculated the deaths of my own children, to walk through the world as a pariah even after being acquitted. The thing that haunts me most isn't even the murders themselves but the years of subtle manipulation before them. All those times Marcus came to our house and I felt uncomfortable but dismissed it as my imagination. All those moments when he looked at me too long or stood too close and I told myself I was being paranoid. All the warning signs I missed because I couldn't imagine someone could be that sick, that twisted, that evil. My therapist tells me that guilt isn't rational, that I couldn't have known Marcus was capable of such horror, that his obsession and his actions are not my fault in any way. But late at night when I can't sleep, I still wonder if there was something I could have done differently. Some way I could have protected my babies from a monster who hid behind a smile and a family name. I want to tell you all this story ends with me finding peace or happiness or some kind of redemption, but the truth is I'm just surviving day by day, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to honor the memory of Emma and Michael and Sophie and David by continuing to exist in a world that took them from me. Some days are harder than others, and some days I can almost smile when I remember Sophie's laugh or Emma's determination or Michael's kindness. Marcus writes me letters from prison that I burn without reading because I have nothing to say to the man who destroyed my entire world out of jealous delusion. He'll spend the rest of his life behind bars while I spend the rest of mine trying to rebuild something resembling a life from the ruins he left behind, and that's as close to justice as this broken world can offer. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening and for not judging me the way so many others have. If this story resonates with you, or if you know someone who's been wrongly accused, please share it and let's start a conversation about how quick we are to judge and how devastating that judgment can be. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel because I share stories like this every single day, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Justice may be slow, but truth has a way of rising to the surface eventually. And I'm living proof that sometimes the innocent do prevail even when the whole world has already convicted them.